Okay, so our group had feminist poetry, and our group members were Mark Franz, Jurien Carter, and Madeline Trost. So, feminist poetry has been around for as long as poetry has been written. You could even argue for as long as we have been singing songs and telling stories. It's not bound to any time period, culture, or region. It doesn't have a prescribed style or voice. Any poetry that elevates female voices or is based on feminist principles or ideals is feminist poetry. Oftentimes, feminist poetry isn't identified as such until it's analyzed in a later era, or as the feminist themes present may be understated, or as we understand the intentions of the artist in a deeper way. Because feminist poetry is such a large, multi-phase topic, we've decided to break it down into four primary chunks. This tactic potentially does a disservice to the many influential artists that don't fall soundly within these categories, but our intention is to cover as much ground as we can. We will explore historic and Victorian feminist poetry, as well as feminist poetry from the 1900s to 1960s, and modern feminist poetry from 1960s to present day. Our focus is primarily on North American poets. We will also be analyzing one or two poems from each era.
Sweet. Thanks, Madeline. So I was tasked with some of the history of feminist poetry, where feminist poetry began, which is kind of a difficult thing to pin down exactly. But a lot of people start with a poet, an ancient Greek poet named Sappho. Not a ton is known for sure about her life, but with the exception of one complete poem, all of her poetry is kind of in fragments, has been found kind of in smaller chunks. But people often credit her as being one of the first feminist poets. She wrote a lot about female homosexuality, a topic that was not getting any attention at the time. And her island of origin was one of the root words for the word lesbian. She came from the Isle of Lesbos, so that's kind of interesting. Um, Other evidence of feminism and female poets show up early in India from 1880 to 1920 in the Common Era. Sanskrit writings of poet Raja Shekhara. This time period, men alone were poets. It was kind of unheard of for females to be a poet, or there's not a lot of lasting poetry from females at the time. But this male poet tells stories of female poets, and he writes accounts of females being storytellers, and existing in that world. He's also one of the few artists from this time period who praises his wife for her contributions to his work, which seems kind of like a small deal for us now, but in that time was kind of unheard of. So progressive Raja Shekhara. Doing a massive leap to the 17th century, we look at English poet, playwright, and total badass Aphra Behn. She was, let's see, a paper described her as extremely liberated for her age. In her plays and poetry, she examines the possibilities of female agency in a male-dominated world. She had a quote about wanting to get paid for her work, and how she was only into writing plays and poetry for the money, which I thought was very interesting. Ben also served as a spy for King Charles after or during her time as a playwright, which is a very, very cool thing. Jumping to Mary Wollstonecraft, she was not a poet, but she was still a big literary figure, a big feminist literary figure. She was also a feminist philosopher, and she argued the point that I hope all of us agree on, that women's intellect is exactly the same as men's. Any difference that was present at the time was due to lack of education available to women. And then just a blurb at the bottom saying that the tale of feminism from ancient times to Victorian times contains the same struggles as we see today. Women's voices are underrepresented, their views brushed off, and their artwork not taken seriously. So these early figures like Aphra Behn and Mary Wollstonecraft helped set the stage for feminist writings, but even to this day, we're obviously a long ways from true equality. So this is an Afro Ben poem that I will not read directly, but you can take your time and read. The poem is about a couple who is in love, and this is only one small stanza of the poem, and the rest is at the link at the bottom. But this poem is about a couple who's in love, and the woman chorus is attempting to ignore the advances of her partner Lysander, and Lysander is not having it and forces himself onto her. So she's writing about wanting to uphold her honor and virginity, and keep her dignity intact. And it's kind of it's a classic. It's unfortunately a classic tale, right? And it explores classic gender roles: men as being powerful and domineering, women as being submissive. I'd say the tone is feminist based on sorry, the poem is feminist based on the tone of it. The author depicts Lysander's actions as something that's super horrible and regrettable, and we feel kind of the pain and indignance that Chloris feels throughout this process, which moves us to Jurien.
All right, thanks, Mark. So I got Victorian era, and although we're calling it the Victorian era, it's only because of it's the 19th century, but it has nothing to do with we're not really only going to talk about England and things like that. So I have to move the okay, there we go. All right. So, like previously stated, it's difficult to pinpoint the start of feminism, and even though that's true, the 19th century is when, the term feminism started being used. People were now identifying as a feminist, and a lot of the political theory behind feminism started focusing on women's suffrage, legal rights, things like that, instead of moral and philosophical beliefs. And then you can go to the next one.
Sorry. Yep.
And so right here we have two of the biggest names, both Emily's. Emily Bronte, she was born in England, and she was extremely intellectual. She's most well known for her novel Wuthering Heights, and she's mostly a romantic poet. It's mostly themes defined by love, nature, loss, things that are kind of the natural world. And she has a poem called "No Coward Soul Is Mine," where she describes herself as like refusing to tremble to the world's storm, and very influential at the time. And Emily Dickinson, right after her, she was heavily influenced by Bronte. She only published 10 out of the thousands of poems that she wrote, even though her family knew that she was a poet and stuff. And she was also kind of romantic, but she was also a lot more melancholic, existential. A lot of these poems are a lot darker and more soul crushing. And even though the ones that were published weren't very experimental or anything, her unpublished ones that became famous later, they're very ahead of their time. They're using slant rhyming, experimental punctuation. She doesn't label any of them, which was really weird for the time. And Bernadette Mayer, the lady that we read about for language poetry, she's actually, compared in our textbook to Emily Dickinson, because you saw a lot of those early experimental things starting to pop up. You can go ahead and skip to the next one. And so I picked these two ladies because it was very difficult to find poetry around the early 1800s, just because the feminist movement really wasn't until the next century. It's kind of halfway in between. But we have Ichio Higuchi, and she was another very feminist poet. She was born in 1800s Japan. Her father was one of the last samurais to ever be sworn in, and she challenged many of the cultural stigmas at the time, and she became the first professional writer in Japan, despite her only being less than 30, right? And she originally studied waka poetry, which is it's an umbrella term for like just classical Japanese poetry, and it follows a 57577 meter. And as she grew older, she kind of went into the category of realism, and she was basically highlighting women on all levels of the social ladder, right? Poor, rich, whatever. Very really good stuff. And Delmira Agostini, she was from Uruguay, and she was extremely talented playwright from a very young age. She was a poet. She pretty much did everything. And her style was considered more modernist, which is it's kind of like romanticism from what I saw, but it's more, I don't know, modern, I guess. It's fueled by societal and ideological changes. So it's still like kind of like pretty to read, but also very like I don't know, what would you say, countercultural? But she hated how she was sexualized for being like, pretty, but she wanted to be recognized for being a very good poet. And I thought she was similar to like beat poets. You can go to the next one. If I'm taking too long, just let me know. No? Okay. So, um, this is an Emily Dickinson poem. They shut me up in prose as when a little girl they put me in a closet because they like me still. Still, could themselves have peeked and seen my brain go round? They might as wise have lodged a bird for treason in the pound. Himself has but to will and easy as a star look down upon captivity and laugh, no more have I. And so it's a really cool poem. She's basically comparing being locked in a closet and being forced to write in a certain way as, having these girlish or feminizing stereotypes pushed upon her, right? She doesn't want to act how other girls act, and that sounds kind of bad, but you know what she's getting at. And it's funny because she was well known to be very well mannered and quiet. She wasn't exactly the most rebellious running around and yelling at people, but in her writing, it's very clear that she despised some of the more feminine stereotypes that were forced upon her at the time. You can go to the next one. This is a really, really pretty poem from Delmira, and it's translated to My Sad Muse, and it basically follows this younger woman who's basically starting to reach like older adulthood, and it describes her walking through a natural scene, and all of the animals and the plants are reacting to her, just like they're, I don't know, gravitated to her. And despite this, she's so focused on like the aging of her eyes and how she's no longer this. She describes herself as a dethroned queen, right? And it's basically critiquing all of these I don't know, these stereotypes about beauty and being young and how like basically older women are kind of pushed to the side for, younger women and things like that. And that was what she was about is, you know, the beauty of feminine sexuality and things like that, no matter the age or no matter who you are. But I
Great.
think that's it for mine, right?
Awesome. Thank you. So that takes us into the early 1900s through the 1960s. Zoom is saying that I need to upgrade in order to have anything more than 9 minutes left. So we may have to make another meeting and kind of stitch together the videos. But we will get through as much as we can. I'll try to get this out of the way a little bit. So a researcher and historian into women's literature and poetry, Christiane Miller, described this period as an excellent time for women poets. She said, in no period before and rarely since have women poets had greater success and influence than in the first half of the 20th century in the United States. So reasons that this quote is true is that there was a cultural shift that improved access to education for women. There's a foundation of women's colleges and co-ed universities, and the push for women's legal and financial rights through the women's suffrage movement. So a lot of big moves. The next slide is about, the next slide is about intersectionality. which is super important to keep in mind during this period specifically, because everything I mentioned on the slide before about women's colleges and equal access to education were primarily for white women, right? So women's suffrage, gave women the right to vote in 1920, but that happened 45 years earlier for white women than it did for black women. So kind of interesting, right? Because we want to celebrate the wins, but they weren't wins for everybody. So with that in mind, the two poets who I chose that I want to talk about aren't maybe the poets you'd think. I think when we were initially doing research and planning this project, Sylvia Plath came up as a really big name, and obviously still is. But the poets we chose were not her. So we chose Alice Dunbar Nelson. She was a poet and women's rights activist. She wrote prose, maybe a little bit more than poetry, but both forms of her writing tackled race, gender, and sexuality. She published multiple books and published her first book at 20 years old, which is super impressive. Later in life, she was a professor. Throughout her entire life, she was politically active and helped promote anti-lynching legislation, which I read into a little bit and is super fascinating. The fact that there weren't outright laws against lynching for a little bit, and it's just kind of mind-boggling that she even had to promote anti-lynching legislation, right? But very, very influential person. This next poet is somebody who I actually read her poetry when I first moved to Chicago. So I lived in Chicago for the last decade, and I lived in the neighborhood next to Bronzeville. And I bought a Gwendolyn Brooks book when I first moved to Chicago. So this is kind of near to me. First ever Black poet to win the Pulitzer Prize. She also held the title that's changed from then to now, but consultant of poetry to the Library of Congress. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it's essentially like a heavy hitting poet laureate of types, I guess. Her poetry focused heavily on racial identity. Some of her most well-known works are A Street in Bronzeville and Annie Allen, were both published in the late 1940s, which put her right up against the civil rights movement of the early 1950s. So I chose a super short, fun poem from Gwendolyn Brooks called We Real Cool. And it goes like this. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. So with poems like this, when it comes to the analysis, I always feel torn between, like, this person is writing this poem just because it's really lyrical and sounds cool and has a good flow to it, or they're like really trying to drive a message home. And I think it can be both, but maybe we can also like over index into over analyzing things. But I do think this poem has a lot of meaning behind it. I think it speaks to rebellion, risk, youthfulness. The speakers are 7 young people hanging outside of a pool hall. They're kind of rebels. They skip school. They stay out late. They may be drinking, defying authority. They are not at all apologetic about their lifestyle. I took the sing sin line to mean that we're upfront and blatant about this lifestyle that we've chosen. The line at the end, we die soon, I thought was interesting because it could have just been a nice way to wrap up the poem, but it also could be, are they dying soon because of this lifestyle that they've chosen that's very rebellious? Is it because they're they're drinking too heavily, or is we die soon a reference to the fact that maybe they're wasting their lives and they're not doing something more productive than what they're doing? And I also made a note that for Gwendolyn Brooks, especially writing in the time she did, rebellion and race were definitely hand in hand. So this poem could also have some racial connotations to it as well. Or, and like I said before, it could just be an ode to youthful rebellion, which we all love, right? Just takes us back to Madeline.
All right, so thank you, Mark. So I taking a look into modern day feminist poetry. It starts in the 2000s, and I think it kind of actually started in like the late 1900s, like 1990s, but mainly it's 2000 forward. But it includes many different poets. Some poets from this period use freeform styles, which means they don't follow the normal rules of normal poetry. Um, these poets tend to share their work online, a lot of social media. That's very relevant in this day and age. So that's how a lot of them do their marketing. And they also often will talk about current issues and current things that are going on in the world to try to make a difference through their poetry and through their art. The poems often tell personal stories about things they've gone through, or just showing women's experiences and how they're similar and different around the world. With social media, we're able to kind of connect with people that you wouldn't be able to connect with before social media. And it kind of gives them a platform to converse with other poets and share ideas and just the different things they're struggling as women around the world. So yeah, all of these things make modern feminist poetry a way to talk about and understand the ongoing fight for fairness between both genders, because in many countries it is still very relevant. Okay, so like we kind of mentioned from the last section, a lot of the work talks about equality for women. And we talked about Sylvia Plath and Adrienne Rich. They were very famous poets in the mid 1900s, but as time passed, a lot of more women joined in, sharing different views and talking about their different views. And today, these poets use various styles to question how society sees things, treats women, and talks about fairness. They often connect with movements for justice between women and race. And then, yeah, I added 2 pictures for there. All right, welcome back. Okay, so I took a look at a few of the most important modern day feminist poets that I thought were really interesting. A lot of us probably have heard of the book Milk and Honey or The Sun and Her Flowers. It was very popular when I was in high school. It's kind of how I first got into poetry. So yeah, that was written by Rupi Kaur. I think I said that right. And another really popular one is The Sun and Her Flowers. Another poet is Warsan Shire, and a few popular poems that she wrote were Teaching My Mother How to Give Birth and Her Blue Body. Another is Ada Lemon. She wrote The Caring and Bright Dead Things, which are both very popular. They've been pretty popular like the last 5 years. And Maggie Nelson, who wrote The Aragonauts and Bluets. Below, I kind of took like one book from these. Oh, you have that one right there. Yeah. So yeah, these poets have all shared their thoughts and feelings about feminism through their poems, who they are and like what's fair in their writings or their views and how they feel about certain things. Each has added something important to the collection of modern feminist poetry. They all talk about different experiences and just the problems that women are facing today. So for one of my poems I chose is from Milk and Honey, and it's called You Are Too Late. So the poem is: sometimes the apology never comes when it is wanted, and when it comes, it is neither wanted nor needed. So this poem kind of explores the theme of apologies and just the timing that apologies can come. The poet reflected on the nature of apologies, kind of just suggesting that an apology may come, but it may not come when it's wanted, or it may come too late. It may not necessarily come when it's desired. And then the second part of the poem is explaining how when the apology eventually arrives, she's basically saying you are too late, meaning that over time the apology has become less important, or kind of just suggesting that the feeling of things being finished or maybe feeling strong or okay on their own. It's kind of what I gathered from that. It seems like the person who was waiting for the apology has moved on and doesn't need it anymore. And I felt like that could kind of relate to feminism and just modern day experiences that I've had with men, or just personal experiences in my life or people I know's lives. I feel like during this era, I guess, a lot of women are struggling with like where their place is in the world because of how much has changed over the decades. And I feel like a lot of men, are sorry for the way they were treated, but some women kind of feel like, it's a little bit too late. Like, I want to make a way for myself and show certain people that I can do this on my own, that I can have a job, that I can get paid the same, etc. So that's kind of how I viewed the poem, to relate to feminism. But yeah. And then the second one I chose is by Maggie Nelson, and it's called Spirit. I'm not going to read this one because it's a little longer, but you can read it if you would like. I inserted a picture of it. But basically, this poem is just talking about family connections, and she's being compared to an ancestor named Jane. And there's a lot of use of metaphors in this, like she uses symbols that are showing her traits that were inherited or passed down throughout families. And basically, this poem spoke to me about feminism because a lot of women are expected to act like how their mom did or how their grandmother did, or pass traditions and carry those traditions on, and they may not always want to, or they may not want to be a stay-at-home mom and not have a job because things are very different now. So I thought this could kind of relate to that, and the sensitivity behind possibly not wanting to be like your ancestors or not wanting to follow the same life that they led when they grew up. So modern feminist poetry and beat poetry and language poetry all kind of bring different ideas to writing. Modern feminist poets, like we've talked about, kind of talks about the fairness between men and women, uses a lot of different styles to share women's stories and to connect with other movements for fairness. The beat poets are more about kind of going against the rules and not liking the way things are. They mostly have men in their group, and they use freeform poetry, which is writing without strict rules, which also feminist poetry uses as well. And then language poets care a lot about breaking down language itself, bringing in lots of different poets who play with words and different forms of that. So those groups are obviously different, but they all want to make a change in their own way. They all are very passionate about what they believe, and they want to express that through their art. Yeah, so each group has its own way of doing this, whether it's telling stories or rebelling against society's rules or playing with words and just writing that poetry. But despite their unique methods, they all add something special to the world of writing.
Awesome. A few sources, a few more sources. I'll stop sharing my screen, and we can wrap up with final thoughts on feminist poetry, how y'all thought the project went, any other footnotes you want to add or slide in at the very end.
I do want to say I tried to find some feminist poetry from Africa, from any of the countries during this time period of the 19th century. And I found out that the majority of poetry back then was like spoken word and usually involved music and things like that. So a lot of those things were kind of lost to history because of, colonialism and things like that, because they viewed it as a lesser art form. So I thought that was pretty sad, but also pretty telling of the time period.
Yeah, absolutely. My final thought is something that I think I shouted out at the very beginning, but is worth kind of circling back to, which is, feminist poetry is such a broad topic. Like writing about the beat poets is a little bit easier and more straightforward because they occupied like a smaller time period, where feminist poetry is so broad. So like it feels like we're not doing it justice with such a short presentation and like highlighting only a few time periods. But did what we can with a very giant immersive topic.
Yeah, definitely kind of going off what you said. There's so many amazing poets that I feel like I didn't even really get to actually look into because there's just so much information from the different time periods. And yeah, it was definitely hard to all combine into a slideshow. There's definitely a lot of really talented poets. So
For sure. Awesome. Thanks very much, y'all. Appreciate you.
Yep.
thank
All right.
you.
Yep. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too. Bye.